consumer products, and pollutants generated from oil and gas drilling. Her research uses a combination of large administrative data sets and community-focused studies. She has published 120 scientific articles and has served on numerous review panels, including for the United States Environmental Protection Agency, National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, and California Geologic Energy Management Division. She's also delivered invited testimony before the U.S. Senate Budget Committee, and so we're really lucky to have her here. This is going to kick off our webinar series for this year, and so I will turn it over to Dr. Deziel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the invitation, the opportunity to speak to you today. Just load my slides here. Yeah, so today I'm going to talk about oil and gas development and pediatric cancer risk and highlight some of the work from our group as well as evidence that we've synthesized from the broader literature. So pediatric cancer incidence is increasing. This audience may be well aware of that. And even though pediatric cancer is rare, it has been increasing at a rate of about 0.8% per year, which adds up and has yielded about a 45% increase over recent decades. And this is consistent with what we're seeing with early onset cancers in young adults as well. And again, though rare, this does mean that more than 15,000 children are diagnosed with cancer each year. And while there have been improvements in diagnostic capabilities and screening technologies, that can't fully explain these trends. In addition, we know that from large-scale genome-wide association studies, only about 10% of childhood cancers are due to a heritable variant, leaving lots of room for the environment to play a role. And we've known about environmental pollutants for a long time, over 250 years, going back to Percival Pott, the British surgeon in 1775, who observed increase in scrotal cancer risk among young men and boys working as chimney sweeps. And then that was not attributed to polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons till much later, but it was attributed to the soot. And I raise this as an example because this recognition of this linkage led to legislation, the Chimney Sweepers Act, new primary prevention strategies around hygiene and child labor laws that subsequently resulted in a decreased incidence in scrotal cancer. So since then, there have been studies trying to determine, what proportion of pediatric cancers could be due to environmental chemicals, with a lot of different estimates. Most of the studies coming around like 15%. This is probably a gross underestimate because we know that of the 80,000 chemicals in commercial use, only a small percentage of them have ever really been evaluated for carcinogenicity. And also just want to highlight, we know that there are disparities in environmental justice issues related to the distribution of exposures among the populations and also, across the cancer continuum. So with that backdrop, I'm going to talk about one specific kind of emerging exposure from unconventional oil and gas development. And I would like to tell you and kind of walk you through kind of my thought process as I've been researching this exposure now for about 10 years. Unconventional oil and gas development has gained a lot of attention in the news and presidential campaign. In part, we've had oil and gas drilling and exploration in the country for a long time, but this unconventional oil and gas development, also known as fracking, has expanded dramatically over recent decades, with about an 8-fold increase in natural gas production coming from this fracking process. And this widespread expansion of this industry has led to about 160,000 active fracking wells around the United States. 4 million people living within a mile of an unconventional oil and gas well, and 9 million people having their drinking water source within a mile of a fracked well. And of course, this includes many children. So what is fracking for anyone who's not familiar? How's unconventional oil and gas development different from conventional? More conventional oil and gas drilling involves drilling a well vertically to a very accessible reservoir that's in low permeable rock and just pumping it up vertically up the well. Unconventional oil and gas development is different in that it involves drilling a well a mile or two below ground and then turning the well bore directly into this very low permeable rock that's non-porous, it's really dense like concrete. Then millions of liters of water, chemicals, and sand are pumped down the well bore under extremely high pressure and expelled into the rock, creating these little cracks or fissures or fracks. And then once the pressure is released, oil and gas that's actually trapped within that dense rock can flow up the well to surface to be collected. Along with the oil and gas, there's also this ancient briny water that's been kind of interacting with natural elements like arsenic, lead, radioactive material. And there's millions of liters of this kind of produced water that also returns up the well, along with the fracturing fluids that went down initially. So all of that has to be managed at the surface and dealt with. So it's a complex, multi-stage process with many potential opportunities for exposures and hazardous releases. So this operation can release things like air pollution. There's a lot of trucks going to and from the sites. There's diesel equipment, construction equipment, drilling equipment, drill cuttings, greenhouse gases, because natural gas, methane itself is a very potent greenhouse gas, and there can be fugitive emissions and leaks. Can be radioactivity when naturally occurring radioactive material is brought to surface through the drilling process. Noise, also something I'm not going to talk about, but of interest for childhood cancers like childhood leukemia. There's an influx of outside workers to work on the oil and gas wells and the pipelines. This industry requires very specialized labor. So while there's some jobs that can be given locally, often there are work camps set up where pipeline workers and oil rig workers come from out of state into neighborhoods. So there's influx of people. Changing of the ecological landscape, stress, different neighbors having different opinions about this industry, the earthquakes. So there's many different factors. When we're thinking about cancer, we could think about things like radioactive material, air pollutants, VOCs like benzene, arsenic, many different things in the water. So lots of potential stressors. And these operations are often occurring very close to homes. So this is a photograph we took out in the field. People have wells being drilled on their property, or even if it's not on their property, it could be on their neighbor's property. So we can have this drilling very close to where children live and play. So in my research group, we had asked the question very early on, could the rapid expansion of all of these oil and gas wells lead to increased risk of childhood cancers? So, would the risk be higher in those children who are living near these complex operations? And kind of before just jumping into tackling that, I also wanted to understand better the exposures and the exposure pathways. And in my group, we've been particularly interested in the role of the drinking water pathway. So first, I'll talk a little bit about some of our exposure work, building towards the epidemiologic work. So, if anyone here, that's probably a lot of people are studying cancer using epidemiologic methods. It's really challenging, especially when you have this new emerging industry. Uh, we have to try to estimate exposures over sometimes years or decades if we were looking at adults. Um, we don't really know exactly what the etiologically relevant time window is for many childhood cancers. We have some ideas for childhood leukemia. It is still a rare outcome, so prevalence of exposure can be just a tricky challenge to build into our studies. And often we're doing case control studies and we're trying to retrospectively reconstruct exposure in the past, which is a challenge. And then with fracking in particular, I just delineated all these different hazards. So which one do we focus on? And, given we're focusing on the water, even among the water, there's been over 1,000 different possible chemicals identified that have been found either in the wastewater or in the fracking fluids. So, which chemicals do we pick? And then finally, a lot of this is occurring in rural America where people are served by private wells, and there is very limited data on drinking water quality or air monitoring quality for that matter. So often the data aren't in the right place or the right time for the right chemicals that we're interested in. So thinking about how we could try to better understand exposure, we could do surveys to understand people's kind of perceptions and observations. We could do biomonitoring, but I think, that's not the first thing we would start with because again, over 1,000 chemicals, what will we even measure? We don't really have a fracking signature yet. But I think now we have a lot more information that we could start doing this. But I'm going to focus on modeling and environmental measurements, which is what we've been doing in our group. So many exposure and health studies have used proximity to oil and gas wells as a way to capture exposure to fracking. And this has many advantages because one, it provides just an aggregate measure of all those stressors that I delineated. So we really don't know which one could be the one driving any health exposure response associations. Also, it's very interpretable and it's policy relevant. I've been involved in talking to policymakers and communities. Policymakers want to know how close is too close, how far is safe. So looking at something like distance is helpful for communicating risks and for informing policies. For example, states have different setback policies, so there's a limit to how close you can drill to a home or a school. However, proximity is not certainly a perfect measure. It's a little imprecise. It doesn't tell you which hazard. Even if we see an association, we don't know if it's because of the water, air, stress, noise. We have no idea. And it also doesn't account for directional dispersion. If the wind's blowing away from the house or the water's flowing away from the house, but you live very close, you're going to have some exposure misclassification there. So in the past 10 years, though, there have been a lot of advancements beyond just simple proximity. And people have looked at like wind-weighted metrics that does account for the directional dispersion. People have looked at flaring, which is like intentionally burning off excess gas, and that can release a lot of pollutants to the air. And in my group, I've had this wonderful collaboration with hydrogeologists where they've modeled the water flow. And, you can see in contrast to sort of the circular buffer that we as epidemiologists typically make around a home and try to determine how close people live to an oil and gas well. When considering the water flow, you can see the buffer is really more of a surfboard shape when taking that into account. So this is something we've tried to apply into our health studies. Okay, so beyond modeling, we have also gone out and tried to take measurements to better understand whether or not there are exposures to known and suspected carcinogens in communities living near oil and gas wells. And this has a lot of advantages. We can do report back. We can provide data in areas that are data sparse, like rural areas, identify high exposure communities. But as I alluded to earlier, it's a little hard to get started. With so many potential contaminants, what do we measure? Also, if we go out, take measurements, it's just one point in time. And this is quite expensive and resource intensive. And then importantly, when trying to think about children's exposure, we could go out and take the best measurements now, but we're really trying to understand what exposures were in the past before the children developed cancer. So that's always kind of a challenge. But we went out into parts of the Appalachian Basin in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia as part of this Yale water study, and collected over 300 measurements from these hundreds of homes to better understand the impacts to drinking water. And how we tried to prioritize our target analytes was by trying to pick things that had been linked to oil and gas development, and then also were health relevant. So we tried to look at that intersection, and we've done a few studies looking at, of all these 1,000 chemicals, which ones have endocrine disruptive or reproductive or developmental toxicities, and how many have carcinogenic properties. So we did this study that was led by my PhD student at the time, Elise Elliott. And we found of all the over 1,000 pollutants, I mean, most of them had not been evaluated for carcinogenicity, because most environmental chemicals haven't been. But of the ones that were evaluated, there were many known or probable or possible carcinogens in the drinking water or the fracturing fluids or the wastewater. Basically, we identified 55 compounds that were IR group 1 or 2 carcinogens, and 20 of those were specifically linked to leukemia. So we went to these homes. We tried to prioritize organic and inorganic chemicals that had health relevance, particularly for children. We collected a lot of different samples, and we also did an interview in GPS so we could map how close people lived to oil and gas wells. So here's some maps of the area. You could see these black circles are all the fracking wells in the area, which every time I see these maps, I've seen them for so many times, though, you could just, it's always kind of striking, just the density of these oil and gas wells. And then these are our different sampling sites in the different states. And again, partnering with environmental chemists like Desiree Plata at MIT and Nikki Booger, her PhD student. We looked at VOCs in the drinking water samples, and this is just a nice heat map showing these are all just different VOCs that we tested for, and the indicator just shows whether we found it in the water, and then the darkness is the concentration. So you can see that there were some VOCs that were relatively highly detected, some were not. The concentrations generally were quite low, and none of them exceeded any EPA maximum contaminant levels. And there were some, but limited correlations with oil and gas proximity. So I'm going to show you more of that now. Here's some more like numerical results from the data. So you could see benzene was one we were particularly interested in. We weren't able to separate it from dichloroethane in the analytical techniques, but you could see that it was present in, Pennsylvania, 75% of samples, although the concentrations are quite low, much lower than the EPA maximum contaminant level. But benzene is a known human carcinogen, so the maximum contaminant level goal is 0. So we would like it to not be in the water at all. But again, the concentrations are quite low. Then we compared, well, are we more likely to detect these chemicals in homes that are closer to oil and gas wells? And we used a very simple proximity metric, like how close are you to your nearest well? We also did an inverse distance weighted metric where we summed up all the wells within a buffer and weighted it by how close they were. And then with my hydrogeologist, we only counted the oil and gas wells that were kind of in the water catchment area that could contribute to drinking water contamination. I'm calling that the water metric. Basically, although there aren't that many correlations, we found for certain chemicals like toluene, xylene, bromomethane, and even benzene, we were like 2 to 3 times more likely to detect a few of the VOCs if our exposure metrics indicated proximity to oil and gas wells. So, it's mixed, but there's some indication that living near oil and gas wells could lead to exposure to carcinogens or leukinogens that we're concerned with. When it comes to inorganics, we saw, for example, very high detection in contrast to the organics, and some health standards were exceeded. For example, here's arsenic in 3 different states. The MCL is 10 micrograms per liter, so we had a lot of homes with higher levels of arsenic. However, there was really no correlation with oil and gas proximity when it came to the inorganics. Again, here's some numerical values. Some, like arsenic, was detected in 80% of samples in Pennsylvania, but not Ohio. Lead, 96% of homes in Pennsylvania, but much lower in Ohio. But I'm not even going to show the correlations because they were really weak. The correlation coefficients, hovered around 0 for these. And what we concluded there was that the inorganics just have a lot of other sources, as well as there are naturally occurring in the rock. Arsenic is very common in these parts. So given all the contributions of other natural and anthropogenic sources, we didn't see any additional kind of correlation with oil and gas. So when it comes to our exposure study, again, we found that the organic chemicals were not detected very frequently and they were at low concentrations, though there were some, like benzene, that were associated with increased oil and gas exposure potential. The inorganics were more commonly detected and sometimes exceeding health-based standards, but they were generally unrelated to oil and gas potential. And so here we're seeing that just living near oil and gas wells isn't necessarily associated with increased exposure from drinking water, probably because there's other sources. Also, when it comes to the water pathway, generally something has to go wrong for the water to get contaminated, in contrast to kind of diesel equipment that's and leaks of methane, which is occurring under normal operating conditions. But with water, there'd have to be some sort of spill or leak, really, for the water to get contaminated. So we think this kind of all points to the fact that water contamination may be just more localized or sporadic, because we did see in our study, there were homes that did have some contamination, and there have been contamination events before, but it's just not broadly correlated with living near oil and gas wells. Okay, so with that, we felt like we had enough information to kind of move on with our epidemiologic analyses. And given what we found with benzene, and some other carcinogens and concerns about radioactivity, we decided to look at oil and gas and childhood leukemia in Pennsylvania. When we embarked on this study, originally there were only 2 other studies at the time, an ecologic study and a case control study conducted by Lisa McKenzie in Colorado that had found an association with ALL, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. So we decided to focus on ALL. As you may know, it's the most common cancer subtype in children. And just generally speaking, it arises from immature B and T cells, and it's thought to result as a result of multiple genetic insults or multiple insults. And it has been linked to some environmental exposures like benzene or radioactivity that we thought could be potentially emitted from these oil and gas sites based on our previous study. So we constructed a statewide, Pennsylvania-wide, registry-based case control study. We obtained all the birth certificates and cancer records and linked all the children who were born in Pennsylvania between 2002 to 2015 to those who were diagnosed in Pennsylvania with ALL between the ages of 2 to 7, the peak onset years between 2009 and 2017. To assign exposures, we did a 5-to-1 match also using the birth certificates matched on birth year. And we obtained the oil and gas well locations from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. And there were 9,500 wells in our study area during that time period. So we used the address at birth to assign exposures. We used 2 models. We used a traditional inverse distance weighted metric where we drew buffers of 2 kilometers, 5 kilometers, and 10 kilometers around the home and determined during different time windows how many wells were active within that buffer and how close were they, and calculated the inverse distance weighted metrics. But we also applied a water specific metric, again, where we only counted wells that were up gradient in the water catchment area that could have contributed to the drinking water well. So we have 2 different metrics, multiple buffers. We also considered 2 different time windows. Again, getting back to that earlier issue, we don't know for sure what the etiologically relevant time window is for ALL. So we looked at from conception to 1 year prior to diagnosis, as well as just the perinatal window. So here's a nice depiction of these proximity metrics. Again, inverse distance weighted metric would count up all the wells within the buffer and weight them by the inverse of the distance squared. So we're giving more weight to wells that are closer, whereas the hydrologic water metric would only count wells that are up gradient and could contribute to a domestic private drinking water well. Okay, so getting to the results here. This is our, and then in the end, the exposure prevalence was too low to do anything more than just binary metrics. We had to just convert all our metrics into exposed or unexposed due to low prevalence of exposure. And what we found here was that children who were born within 2 kilometers of an oil and gas well had twice the odds of developing childhood leukemia compared to those who were born further away. And we have 2 models with some different adjustments, but they're pretty consistent. And one interesting thing you can see here is a nice kind of gradient, like a dose response gradient, where as the buffer size gets bigger, the effect estimates are attenuated, suggesting that 2 kilometers is really, closer is more important, or that's the one that's associated with increased odds of childhood leukemia. And then here's just looking at the perinatal window of exposure. We do see that the effect estimates are higher, but the confidence intervals are less precise, and we see a similar kind of gradient. And this was led by Cassandra Clark, who was my PhD student, and she's now a postdoc at University of Minnesota. And here are the results using our water-based metric. They're pretty consistent with what we saw just using regular inverse distance weighted metrics. Although again, some of the effect estimates are a little higher, but we just have less precision here. But is suggesting that this water pathway could be important. And we found these results to be pretty striking. This pretty clear 2-kilometer, twofold increase in childhood leukemia in those children living closer to oil and gas wells compared to those living farther away, even after controlling for multiple variables. And this added to a lot of other evidence of other impacts to children's health, like adverse birth outcomes. So this received a lot of attention. We tried to use this study among other studies to try to inform setback distances for oil and gas wells to ensure that oil and gas wells are not drilled close to homes and schools. And so then, since we published our study, there have been a couple new studies. And the last part of my talk, I want to tell you about a recent systematic review we just conducted, and a special issue organized by Mark. So I appreciate the invitation to contribute this. We decided to look at both unconventional and conventional oil and gas and see what does the body of evidence tell us. We know oil and gas can release carcinogenic radioactive materials. And in this study, we looked at children, adolescents, and young adults up to 25 years of age. We didn't restrict on publication year or country, but we didn't look at any downstream oil and gas. Like, we didn't look at petrochemical facilities or oil refineries. We're really looking at oil and gas production. And we have the protocol published, very systematic, 2 reviewers screening each article, extracting the data, and doing a risk of bias estimate. So in our paper, in our protocol, we have all the details about our search strategy and our comparisons. And here is what we found from the case control studies that used distance as a proxy for exposure. So many of the studies were ecologic in nature. Of all the studies we looked at, more than half reported significant associations between residential proximity to oil and gas and pediatric cancers. And the most consistent association we observed was for childhood leukemia. And this was a collaboration with Eric Stewart, a PhD student at Berkeley, and Catherine Metier, also at Berkeley. So here was our study. These are the results I just showed you. Then Lisa McKenzie of Colorado conducted a newer study in Colorado, where she looked at acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And I think it's remarkable to me how similar these results are in a completely different state, a different set of researchers, where they see a similar gradient and a very similar magnitude. They looked at 3 kilometers, we looked at 2 kilometers. Then there was another study conducted in certain section of Pennsylvania, 8 counties that were very active with drilling. And again, their results were again quite consistent with what we found. They had many fewer cases in their study. Then looking at, there were a lot of ecologic studies that just kind of compared areas with and without oil and gas activity. These are also childhood leukemia studies, and just many of them also found about a 2-fold increased risk of childhood leukemia. This one looked at mortality. So not all, they're not all consistent, but many of them, and including the stronger study designs of case control studies, are painting a pretty consistent picture thus far. So to conclude, I think our research is part of growing evidence linking oil and gas development to childhood leukemia. I think taken together, the fact that we have 3 well-conducted case control studies, all showing very similar effect estimates, supports the need for improved public health protections for children. There's still a lot of unanswered questions. We could use bigger sample sizes. We don't know much about other cancers other than leukemia. And there's always room to improve the exposure assessment. However, I think this provides enough evidence to inform stricter policies. And with that, I will thank all my collaborators on this body of work, and I'm happy to take some questions or have discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Deziel, for your amazing presentation and for your work on this topic. I just wanted to open it up to the rest of the audience if they had questions. I also see some questions in the chat. So Barbara Laxon asked about abandoned wells and if there was any way to look kind of at that.
Yeah, excellent question from Barbara. This is another big issue, I think, where the field is going. So there are many wells that were drilled before there were regulations, and then either orphaned or abandoned, so they may not have a responsible party. They could be leaking some of the same types of pollutants to the air or water. There aren't necessarily good records for these, but there are many researchers going out and documenting where they are. It's also, potentially a justice issue of where these are. And I don't know of any health studies yet, but I think that I'm sure they're coming. And I know in my group this is something we're talking about. So I think including not just the active wells, but also these abandoned wells is important. So this could even be just kind of undercounting the sources.
That's amazing. And then one of the program coordinators from our institute, Jen Acevedo, she was wondering about your model adjustments, particularly around food assistance.
Yes, thanks for that question. In our maybe I can get back to it. Some of our models in our study, we're limited to what's available on the birth certificate. So we've adjusted for year of birth, maternal race, and food assistance like WIC food stamps. And we're using this kind of as a proxy of SES as a potential confounding variable. Yeah, and I guess the point being that the results are similar when we adjust and when we don't adjust. And we had considered many other factors, but they had no effect whatsoever, so we didn't include them.
Thank you. And then Dr. Wood said, thank you, that was great. And so why did you not look up until ALL diagnosis? I saw it stopped 1 year prior to diagnosis in your original case control study.
Yeah, so we I'm like open to discussion for this, but what we decided was, we have to account for some sort of latency or onset of disease. So if we included, it's not in our thinking, it's not as plausible that if a well was drilled a week before diagnosis, that could have feasibly contributed to the cancer development. So we are allowing this 1 year kind of latency period to allow for onset of disease. We could try some different things, but that's somewhat standard in leukemia studies until we know more about what the proper latency period is.
Got it.
Yeah, And someone
Then
asked, Barbara also asked about data sources. Yeah, we typically go to the states because, that's the official regulatory data. But actually, we also kind of get different data from different sources within the state and do a lot of cross checks. And this is a huge effort to get the oil and gas data. There's often missingness. Yes, but the DCNR, actually, I'm not sure exactly what that stands for. If Barbara wants to put that in the chat, but there are the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection is kind of where you have to submit permits and things. And there are some other production data sets that we use and try to cross-check all of this.
Then Warren was asking, could there be carryover from some of these risks to produced wastewater from drilling? Given the prevalence of leukemia in these studies, could naturally occurring radium be relevant to these trends? So I think kind of getting at other environmental exposures that may be in more rural areas or, just even in the land in general.
Yeah, great point. I definitely think about the radioactivity. This is very understudied. And also for this audience may know about like radium and the radium dial girls who were exposed to radium from licking paintbrush tips when they were watch dial painters. And there are some suspected sarcomas, like Ewing sarcoma, some suspected cancer clusters in Pennsylvania. None of this is, been proven scientifically, but certainly communities worried about it. And there is radium in the water. There have been some really fascinating studies by more environmental scientists, like measuring like mollusks and the surface waters and finding radium and radioactive material. So yeah, I think radiation and radioactive materials is a big gap that could be underlying some of these. Again, because we don't know what the key exposure is. We just know we're just really more looking at proximity.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what Dr. Newman's next question is. Any ideas as to what chemicals might be involved in the increase of ALL? Could diesel exhaust be a factor, air pollution measured? And I think even more to that, do you have a sense if it's like the water, the air, maybe a combination of both of them?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. On one hand, the air is like a little more continuous. As I mentioned, like normal operations are releasing materials into the air. So, that may be that may be more responsible. But we can't rule out the water. And as I mentioned, I think it's probably more localized or episodic. So it's harder to catch, it's harder to measure at the right place or the right time. But I think diesel exhaust, yes, 1,3-butadiene, benzene, radioactivity, like are all good candidates. We need more measurements to try to figure this out. And thank you, Barbara. I will look into the DCNR data resources to make sure we're considering those as well. Maybe there's some more data out there.
And then I was curious along the same lines of like the or the kind of the attributing to the air or the water, maybe both. Have there been any like efforts to reach out to these communities and kind of tell them how to protect their well water or, their air?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Actually, I didn't really talk about this with the field work, but doing the field work and being from Yale and going into these areas of Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, it would not have been possible without a lot of community outreach. So I have these wonderful community partners that I've been working with for about 10 years. So we have a lot of conversations with them about what they're worried about. And yeah, I have another paper kind of actually Mark is on that one maybe, or he was on, I don't know, emerged from this panel we were both on, but kind of trying to figure out the hierarchy of controls, like what can people do. Because on one hand, this really, in my view, needs to be a policy level, but communities can advocate for these setbacks, and those can be very useful to keep the drilling farther away. But that doesn't really get at the problem, because they're just moving them farther away, but they're still releasing greenhouse gases and air pollution. So engineering controls could help. But and then we have recommendations about like air cleaners or water filters, but it's very hard because it's such a complex mix. There isn't like one device that could help reduce people's exposures. So.
Yeah, it's really tough because it is the public health aspect of it. But then, yeah, these kids are living closer, and I was curious too, is there like it seems like there's increasing numbers of these oil and gas wells. And so that where your adjustment came from, like the year of diagnosis to kind of get at kind of like how many could have been around at that time?
Well, we characterized precisely how many wells were around each individual child at birth, but we were adjusting for year of birth, really just for other like
Got it.
cohort
Okay.
effects, other things that might have been happening at that time.
Got it. Any other questions from the audience? Oh, looks like well, asking about chemical migration through once in the aquifer.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think someone mentioned something too about the wastewater. Yeah, this is water is so complicated, I think, because chemicals do migrate, and that's what's difficult. Like proximity is not the best proxy for drinking water contamination exposure, because um it depends on the properties of the chemicals, the soil, how soluble they are, how quickly they move through the water, the topography, like all of these variables. So that's why I've been working with these hydrologists to try to better work on that. And actually, my collaborator, Jim Sayers, the hydrologist, he's still working on this and improving his models to better predict kind of if there's a spill, where would the contamination go? And that could be used to do more testing, issue warnings, health monitoring. So, yeah, that's a great point. Okay.
And then somebody asked about the incidence of AL higher with perinatal only exposed children versus all childhood exposures.
Yeah. Yeah. So, when looking at this like larger exposure window, we saw a twofold increase in odds. Then the perinatal exposure window, it was 2.8. So, I mean, it does suggest, uh, these effect estimates are of greater magnitude, which I think is interesting because other studies of other pollutants have found that the perinatal exposure during the perinatal window is more important. However, I just want to be cautious about it because the confidence intervals are kind of wide, but I think that's worth following up on. I think that's certainly suggestive that the perinatal window might be important.
And it looks like we have another question around maternal health and amount of time parents were exposed. So kind of even getting at more of that perinatal exposure window.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great point. We really don't have data on that because, as I mentioned, we're kind of limited to information on the birth certificate. We didn't interview anybody. This is entirely using records, cancer records and birth records. So, I think that's kind of a gap that we just can't really address. Yeah, it's a good point.
And then we have a question about, are there national databases of well locations?
Yeah, so now there are, there's a commercial database that's national. I should change names. So now I'm oh my gosh, it'll come to me. But we use it sometimes because yeah, a lot of studies are done on a state-by-state basis because this industry is regulated at the state level, and different states have kind of different data. But there are there are these national databases, but they require a fee, at least the ones I know about. But there are some other sources. If anyone's interested, there was a paper I co-authored led by Mary Willis at Boston University that kind of reviewed all these different data sources. It's a really nice paper. And it was like the advantages and disadvantages of some of the different data sources.
That's so interesting. And then I think we have maybe time for a few more questions. Can you share the citation of the paper discussing controls?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you could elaborate on that, but I'd be happy to share any of the papers from the presentation. Maybe the slide number.
Yeah, this presentation is also recorded, so
Okay.
the attendees will be able to, you know, kind of look at this back in time too.
Okay, and anyone can, you're welcome to email me if you have questions as well. Oh, the filters, yeah, okay, I can send the hierarchy of controls paper. Sorry, I thought you meant like, I was thinking about controls differently. Yeah, the hierarchy of controls paper. See, can I put it? Maybe I can put it in the chat right now. Hannah can tell me if there are other questions. I'll try to multitask.
Yes. Any other questions? This was absolutely fabulous, and I think such a great discussion and really showing how much interest there is on this topic, and amazing work that you have been doing in this area. So I just wanted to share my screen one more time. And I just wanted to, oh, come on. Okay, well, it's just going to share like this. There we go. So I just wanted to thank everybody for coming today, and thank Dr. Deziel so much for her time and, like I said, this amazing work. And I wanted to highlight that we're having our next webinar in December 8th at 3 p.m. Eastern. Dr. Michael Schur is going to be talking, and he's going to be presenting on his research and recent publications related to ambient fine air particulate matter and residential green space and childhood cancer risk. So please stay tuned for that webinar invite. And then I wanted just to let everybody know that we have a newsletter for our Childhood Cancer and the Environment project. And so the QR code is there if you're interested in signing up for our newsletter. And then finally, we would love your feedback on these webinars. So this is kind of our second year that we've been doing this series, and it's been really enjoyable to have such wonderful guests join us and talk about their research around this really important topic of environmental exposures in pediatric cancer. And so this short survey will help us to even better tailor our webinars to meet everybody's needs and to, again, discuss this important topic. So here's the QR code for the survey. It will also go out in an email to everybody tomorrow. So I just wanted to thank everyone again for joining us, and thank you so much, Dr. Deziel. We hope that you guys will join us again in December.